Rise up, the Dukes are back, and now it's time to rise up. The crew is back, and now it's time to rise up. The Dukes are back, and now it's time to rise up. Rise up, rise up. The Dukes are back, and now it's time to rise up. The crew is back, and now it's time to rise up. The Dukes are back, and now it's time to rise up. Rise up.
Welcome back to a special edition of the D's on Fire podcast with Alec Hoff celebrating his birthday this weekend. Brought in Zac Weiss, the one who actually knows all of the things of Duquesne basketball and is not just a fan who comments on what he sees. We'll start with women's basketball since their regular season just wrapped up. They went on a good run of wins and then played the two teams that were above them in the standings that they needed at least one of those wins. Turned out after all that it didn't matter whether they got one of those wins. They were basically locked into the 5 spot after they lost to Richmond, but we found that out later on. Zac, what stuck out to you during that run? It seemed like they found somewhat of an identity, and now it's just coming down to executing against the teams that have just as much talent as them.
I think what stuck out to me really was the choice that came on December 22nd after a loss to Little Rock, after a loss to Maine, and even after that Vermont loss in which they were riding such a high against Longwood. It was kind of a nutty game because they had to play it at La Roche, and then they don't even show up into Vermont until 1-2 o'clock in the morning on the day of a game. So really there's a lot to be said about that stretch in particular, where I think that Dan, and we outlined this before, Dan just wasn't sure what to go with, and the first quarter was kind of a slot machine. And when you have 10 minutes where even if you mentally feel like you're playing with house money and you're just going to let it ride, that means that you have to put a lot of stress and burden on those 30 minutes. And what really, I think, saved the team were those two stretches, that December 21st to December 30th stretch heading into that Dayton game. And even though they lost the Mason game, that December 30th to January 7th stretch where they could offensively go 5-on-0 a lot. They could add a lot more defense and believe in the defense becoming a conviction and an identity towards what this team could be. And really, I think when you look at what the key was, I think it was that Dayton game. And while it turned out that Dayton didn't achieve what I think some people did think they would achieve this season, I think when you have such a long period of inactivity, when you're so used to the student athlete lifestyle of having a game, 2 games a week, and you're kind of grinding and finding a way and learning in between, when you learn so much and you trust yourselves and you trust your staff to get a result, and you get such a decisive result, I mean, 70-42 to start your league play, I think turned a lot of heads. I think a lot of people saw that really as a 50-50 game that might have turned Dayton's way. And those people that counted Duquesne out kind of learned a little bit of a lesson in what ended up being a very top-heavy half of the Atlantic 10 Conference, at least with as far as the top 5 are concerned. Duquesne did everything they were supposed to do, and the losses kind of had some commonalities. They definitely tried. They threw kitchen sinks at it. They made several changes, but they were just lulls that they just couldn't get themselves out of. And it just happened to be against top teams. And that by no stretch says any indication of what Duquesne is. It's more of an indication of the quality of basketball that was played on that court, even as recently as the St. Joseph's game, which was yesterday at the time of us doing this pod. So the standard is really elevated, and they've met that standard, but you have to maintain that standard and take advantage of the opportunities when they're presented to you. And really, that was the prevailing thought of why they ended up as the 5. But while, yes, they don't get a bye, I think maybe as they enter, as Dan Burt likes to call it, their 3rd season, I think they're going to enter a little bit ticked off. And ticked off Duquesne might not be something that a lot of Atlantic 10 programs really want to see. And a ticked off Duquesne might be the difference in what could be a historical first Atlantic 10 championship. But there's a lot to do, and that starts with the Monday practice, and then the sense of urgency they have and how they respond in the face of adversity is going to be really, really telling this week.
Yeah, I don't think there's going to need to be much motivational pep talks to get the team refocused. This is an experienced bunch. They know a lot of graduating seniors, which was shown on senior day, where they basically started all of the healthy ones, which a lot of teams do, but especially in a game that mattered that much, that was still kind of a decision that, well, it was easier based off the fact that all four of those seniors are major contributors to the team. Lauren Wasselson having her best game as a Duke, as Coach Burt pointed out, was lights out from three, then started at shooting guard. Tess was on the bench to make way for that, and then Amaya started at the three instead of the four to let Precious and Yanni get the starts. And I mean, all of them played really well. The one of the commonalities that I've noted in those losses against the upper echelon A10 teams has been the 3-point percentages of those teams. Some of that's chalked up to they're just hitting their shots. Some of it opening up to they're leaving some people open when they're trying to do help defense, and it, maybe that's a point of emphasis moving forward where we really can't do that, especially against players that are 4 for 5 or 4 for 4. I think the two top scorers on St. Joe's was at the end of the game. So that's one area where I don't know if there's really a way to improve that because it's always happening when they're trying to cover somebody else. But that's got to be one of those things where if we can stop the threes from falling at a 50% clip, I like our chances a lot better.
Well, I think there's a lot to be said too that they're trying to junk it in inside so they can get into that Phoenix Suns style offense that they like to run, moving quick and being dangerous with the ball. So sometimes you have to gamble, but in a sense, there was a lot of similarities in that St. Joseph's game to that George Mason game, but it felt like Duquesne wasn't as desperate as they were to try to figure it out in the Mason game as they were in the Joe's game. They were right there. They were figuring things out, but just really, I think the difference was the second quarter, which they made shots, but what they weren't able to do was they had two St. Joe's starters, really dynamic starters, in Mackenzie Smith and Talia Brugler, who both of whom very well could and probably should make all conference teams when the coaches vote on that later on, probably either today or tomorrow at the time of the pod. But really, those two being so dynamic, that's when you have to stomp and give them credit. They were advantageous, but you knew third quarter when they had a chance to get those two back and reset that they were going to go off to the races. And you have to take that period and take full advantage of it. And defensively, I don't know if they fully did that. And then I think in the third quarter, they just got stuck in a lot of ways. They just got stuck and really probably, could have made adjustments quicker, but you just get stuck. And it's something that's really been, again, prevalent in these conference losses that you kind of get stuck. And yeah, I mean, there was a lot of confusion, like you mentioned in the last point, Nick, about what the circumstances and scenarios were to get the 4 seed. It ended up that the prevailing error was the initial thought, which was supported by the conference, was Duquesne wins and they're in. They didn't take care of business in that regard, but that was a circumstance that was based on a 2-team tiebreaker versus a 3-team tiebreaker, which had Duquesne won, they still needed Richmond to win, which they did. And congrats to the Spiders for their first ever A10 title. And they needed George Mason to go on the road to VCU, which we've seen is a tough place to play, and get a result there. And they lost Kennedy Harris in the first quarter on a very, very difficult to watch play. And obviously, health and prayers to her. And we'll have to see what happens there and if she's available for Henrico later this week. But that was a tough task. I think they were motivated, but they just ran out of gas. And they definitely were scoreboard watching at halftime to see what was going to happen in that. And a couple looked over to me when they thought the game was final, and I gave them a thumbs down. And at that point, I mean, you're fighting for the 5, but there's still a lot to fight for because you felt like as a team you owe St. Joe's one. And to begin with, you also want the momentum going into tournament play. And yeah, you have some momentum. Lauren had her best game of the season. I don't know if I'd go as far to say her best game overall, but it was definitely probably her most rounded. it was the third time Meg McConnell had ever fouled out actually in a Duquesne uniform. It was her first time since January 15th of 2022, to let you know how long it's been since Meg McConnell fouled out of the game. And I think that there was a lot of frustration on some calls that were getting missed, but I think it was also some frustration that the Hawks were just making so many shots, especially from their most dynamic players, and they just couldn't find ways to get timely stops at timely points in the game. And just it was rushed. And I think that third quarter spell kind of was the end of the game. And to give them credit, they still fought, but it just wasn't enough. There just wasn't enough to put it away. And it started on that defensive end. And it felt like offensively, they might have been a little bit overwhelmed because they were trying to figure out the defense and try to switch defenses up, which definitely frustrated them, especially in the second quarter. I saw Hawks coach Cindy Griffin pound her hand on the table at one point. So they had them right where they wanted to. They just couldn't get the full stomp down to make that statement going into halftime.
Yeah, and another part that happened in that third quarter that added to the frustrations was they had, I think there was a period possession where they had 3 layups just go rim out. Ended up with 0 points on that possession with legitimately 3 layups where they weren't even that well contested. It's just the ball wouldn't fall, and I think the one of the announcers brought up that there must be a lid on that rim because it happened so often for them in that stretch in the third quarter where the ball just wasn't falling. So yeah, frustrations keep mounting, making it harder and harder. That's what happened in the Richmond game, the game before as well. You and I noted that once that run in the third quarter hit, that game felt like it was over, and it kept going after that for a while until kind of the dogs were let off, and that was another lapse where they it's just got to be shorter, I think, for them to really have a chance to fight back against especially when you're comparing skill. There are 5 top teams in the A10. Duquesne's one of them, and I think they showed in the first half that if they, and I messaged you this yesterday, they should take into account that first half showed they can beat any team in the conference if they're playing their A game, but they have to play it the whole way through. That's really the difference.
Well, sure. And I mean, and this might pull at your heartstrings a little bit. This is Duquesne's most talented team since the NCAA tournament team, and it's not even close. No offense to the other team that made it to the A10 championship, but this team is the most talented team. But one of the big bugaboos from that NCAA tournament team, especially come the third season, was those dry spells and that they just couldn't find answers in timely points. It happened against UConn. Well, granted, they were UConn. It happened against GW in the championship game and so on down the line. And that was back in 2016. And yeah, there's a lot of comparable, but I think you have that prep time, and those 2 long breaks really served Duquesne well because it rebuilt them. But I don't think this long break really helped this team because they were rolling. They had things really figured out. And when you pull a kid from the candy store and they're all sugared up, what's going to happen? I mean, yeah, they still played very well. They played 2 very good basketball games. It's just the other team was better in most, if not all, aspects of the game. And that stop, I think, really did affect them. And I think in that sense, having 1 bye versus a double bye might be an advantage for them versus the double bye. But if you're the coaching staff, and I think this is what they have done, the goal has been that double bye. So of course, in the locker room, those ladies are hurting and they're ticked off, and I'm sure they're gonna not they have an extra day to wallow in their sorrows a little bit before they come back Monday and they focus for what's about to happen in this run that they want to go on. They still have high aspirations, and there's no reason to feel the need to do so. Although postscript, I wish that I heard that from a player and I had not just heard that from Dan after the game. That was quite a disappointment, which I understand is senior day. I understand it's a loss, but there's an expectation there that was not met. And frankly, Dan was very, you could tell the emotion was getting to him, the constant rubbing of eyes, the lengthy time in between his answers. And even at the end, when I asked him, when he said, "Oh, and we couldn't get the win for our seniors and, everything they put in," when I asked him, "That's what hurts the most," he paused really long and he said, That's exactly what he said. He said yes, that hurts. Yeah. So there's a lot of hurt, and I think they're all going to just take a mental day today just to get away. I don't think anybody's even going to touch a basketball, but I think right now they're after when Monday starts, it's a business trip, and they're going to have to figure it out and right the ship and see let the chips fall where they may. But maybe this is like I said in the first answer, I feel like maybe this could be a blessing in disguise. Now, granted, LaSalle and UMass, who they would play one of those on Thursday in their first game. That's those were two very challenging matchups. UMass is a team that throws some stuff in that Duquesne doesn't like, and LaSalle plays a very physical game where the first 15 seconds are kind of dead and they're waiting for you to make a mistake. So it's going to be on Duquesne to really pay attention to detail in those games. And just because they weren't successful, the two opponents weren't successful this season, doesn't mean that they can't be successful in a one-game scenario. So, as much as I'm sure people are looking forward to possibly facing George Mason and exacting some revenge, the first game isn't exactly an automatic layup either. So they could easily lose the first one as much as they could win the whole thing if they're not careful. So really, it's P's and Q's time. It's crunch time for them, and they just have to find a will and a way to win.
Yeah, and they're well aware of the possible risk there of losing and going home after last year's GW game. So that
The post game presser was tough for a lot of reasons for me to watch.
I can't imagine being in the room like you asking Dan those questions when he was in that sort of I guess emotional state. I mean, there's a lot of things that popped up in there. Obviously, there was some mention of the future of the program beyond this year too, because there might not there might only be one more game this year, but that it's tough to really focus on that from a fan standpoint when you see so much potential from this team, but at the same time, like you said, it could just be one more game. And that could be this entire season with this talented team that is the most talented since that tournament team. And even before that tournament team, this still might be the second most talented Duquesne team. Yeah, it's tough. I don't know really where to transition there. I guess we can talk about some of the tournament expectations, but you kind of touched on what to expect from that first game, and then after that, we'll see what happens. You can't even go too far beyond that one game with expectations because of what happened last year. I didn't look past George Washington last year, but at the same time, I still thought that based off of how coach was talking in the post game pressers last year, that that team had a chance to make a run, and they have basically the same talent this year, with the exception of additions to Journey, which has been a huge addition. I don't want to put that lightly. And there have been some contributors throughout the season with Grantham Medley, and I'm trying to think of who else. Brown played some minutes early on when they were trying
DeAndre
to
was
sort
big
out the
early
rotation.
non-con.
Yeah. But going into the tournament, I think it is going to be a rotation of basically the same players from last year, with Journey getting some minutes. So last year, they ended the post game presser with saying everybody's coming back, we're going to be dangerous. Now's the time to prove those statements to be true.
Yeah, at this point, you've made your statements and it's time to prove yourself. And this team has consistently been one that's been eager to do so. And I mean, I think they're going to get a lot of motivation when it comes time for the all conferences and everything, because you have a team that's the fifth ranked team in the conference. And again, even you're probably only going to get one player that the coaches are going to give respect to, and that's Meg McConnell. And even then, I mean, dynamic league, are they going to try to out that and not put her on the first team? Are they going to not put her on defensive? Are they going to try to shortchange someone else? How much of it's Dan going to use as motivation for someone like Nay, who's been a lightning in a bottle sometimes, like Amaya, who's rediscovered herself, and those two possibly and most likely not making a team for the all conference. And with the A10 going to 6-player teams, that's the top 18 players in the conference, and it's very possible that Duquesne gets slighted. And can he use that as motivation? Because at this point in time, you use everything you can as motivation, and Dan's never been shy in the past about doing that, and I'm sure he would not be shy to do it again if that opportunity arose. So I think they're going to scout long. They're going to scout hard with that first Wednesday game, because the first Wednesday game is that LaSalle UMass game, a noon tip off. And really quick little sidebar, just before I go even any further, just my absolute condolences. I don't know what the right word is, but just my apologies to Davidson. Just it's very a shame how Davidson had to end their season prematurely due to so many injuries. Just it was a program that was poised to be a top 4 seed based on non-conference. They gave so many teams that run for their money. They beat Duke, who's projected to be an NCAA tournament team, among others. They played a very difficult team and a very difficult non-conference schedule, and they did it lovingly and fearlessly for each other. And just as A10 play rolled along, just so many losses to that team, and they already had a couple of decent big losses, impact players before the season. So my heart goes out to Gail Folks, the coach, and the entire roster, just for as high as the season was and what the season could have been, for it just to end without being able to make the trip to Henrico is just absolutely heartbreaking. So my heart absolutely goes to them in what's a very difficult time, but hopefully they can appreciate the successes and for what the season was and how as women they grew on and off the court. But that leaves Duquesne facing LaSalle and UMass, and that actually backdoored George Washington into avoiding a first round game. So George Washington was the biggest beneficiary of Davidson having to bow out of the not just Atlantic 10 tournament, but any postseason play in season. And that's a tough pill to swallow because they had been projected in so many brackets for a decent part of the Atlantic 10 season. Just for it to end like this is just very much a shame. But as it is, you still have 14 teams in the Atlantic 10 tournament, and Duquesne knows that they know what the stakes are, and they know they're going to have to work hard against LaSalle or UMass. And assuming they get a positive result in that one, they know what awaits. They know they're playing at the same time. They would be potentially playing the next game the same time, the 1:30 if they win both days. So really there's a lot to be said about just that aspect of it, just having that familiarity of it. But you also know that George Mason will be watching every single thing that you do in that game. So in that sense, they're going to have a leg up, and the film that you're going to have on them is a brutal reminder of every single shot they made from all across the court. It seemed like they were playing a game of horse, and that's always tough to deal with. But if Duquesne comes in motivated and they come with the right mindset, the sky is the limit. This really is five. I really feel that there are 5 teams that could win this. I feel that Rhode Island at number 6 could win it. They have the pieces, but even though they beat Dayton Saturday, I kind of feel like they limped to the finish a little bit. And I do think that since Duquesne has played them, Tisha Hyman being healthy is going to help them a lot. You've had several players that have made impacts. Of course, Maya Torre leading the way, Sophie Phillips taking a jump. There's so many players across the court there that are good players and know their roles. The Dee Dee Davis transfer was a sneaky good transfer for them. Duquesne got a chance to see that last season during non-conference play, how she could put the ball in the basket, and she can defend too. So, I mean, don't count Rhode Island out. They still were the preseason favorite, and if they can get one, maybe they can pull off an upset. It just depends on how things go. But I mean, St. Joe's we just saw is a very, very tough out too. So really Duquesne has an opportunity, but as much of the opportunity them winning, again, if they're not careful, is as much of the opportunity as if they flinch. So we'll have to see what happens. I would still be optimistic. I think this team has every reason to be optimistic, but again, they have to be aware that when you have big dreams, you have to, as they say in WrestleMania season, you have to finish the story. So it comes down to what transpires and just the belief and love and hoping that wins. And it did for St. Louis last year, and St. Louis made the run as the 4, and they got hot at the right time. And Duquesne's been getting hot at the right time too. Dan said 10 of 13. That's a pretty good streak there. So they're going to have to find it. They've won every game they're supposed to, and now they're going to have to win every game to tell their story. So it'll be interesting to see this week how it all unfolds.
Yeah, and to keep that going, if they do win it all, I think they'll finally get the acknowledgement that Dan has craved from the A10 when it comes to respecting Duquesne. I From the A10 standpoint, it's kind of mind-boggling to me that there's 5 teams that could realistically win it all, and the NCAA is probably only going to have the winner make the NCAA tournament. That I understand it's a much bigger deal on the men's side of things when it comes to bracketology, but is there any movement from the A10 standpoint as to figuring out how to possibly make the women's side a multi-bid league more regularly?
I mean, all you can do is schedule those non-conference games and hope that you come out on top. And when you play those non-conference games, they're not going to be at home. So you really have to steal one to get a result. And then on top of that, not only do you have to get the result, but you have to hope that they do what you're expecting them to do on top of that as well. So there's a lot of biconditional statements in that where the Atlantic 10's in a tricky spot. And my friend A10 Talk colleague Daniel Frank really put a good piece out there earlier in this A10 slate about trying to promote the A10 and looking at blind resumes. And if you look at blind resumes, well, there should be multiple Atlantic 10 teams in. Now, I will say if Richmond does not win this week, the whole A10 tournament, I don't think their case is necessarily as strong as what UMass's is, just because UMass had Sam Breen and just what she was able to do. Could they still make it? I think there's a chance, but then you're really tempting fate in a lot of these tournaments, and then you're hoping that everybody that's in the Cinderella conferences doesn't have a Cinderella come through. There's just so many ifs and there's so many things that you can't control. So there's only one thing you can control, and that's going out and winning the whole thing. So really, there's no safe bet. I would say that, I mean, I don't know if George Mason even has a shot, just because I mean, they had a couple of bad flinches within conference when Sonia Smith was injured. VCU has a shot because I think their name's been out there, having made the tournament, the turnaround they had, the fact that Beth O'Boyle as a coach was given consideration as a national coach of the year. So their story is to a degree out there. And I would say St. Joe's might have a shot as well. I mean, I think the Fordham flinch wasn't really a good flinch. It was a great win for Fordham, and initially people thought that Fordham win gave the Duquesne Dukes their win and in scenario, which was unfortunately a little bit short-sighted. But really more so, I think that the Hawks really are the most consistent team. You know what you're going to get from them, and you know who you're going to get it from. But what makes the Spiders so dangerous is they have such a dynamic lineup, and they have such a strong sixth in Rachel Ulstrom that has really made a lot of jumps this year too. And I don't think she gets enough flowers within the conference. I think going in there was a lot about Addie Budnick. There's a lot about what Grace Townsend and how her speed can change the game. Maggie Dugan as a breakout freshman and having an amazing sophomore year. She managed to elevate her game as a sophomore. Just so many of those players having breakouts. And I think with VCU, I mean, you knew that Sarah Tibiasu was going to be very ticked off from the injury last year. And I think that was a team that didn't reach its potential anywhere close to it last year because of their injuries. But you have some good players, and you have some players that really know their role and really sell out for their role in so many amazing ways. And that's what makes that team so dangerous. And when it's a possession at the end of the game where they need to find a score or they need to find a stop, they're capable of doing so in rhythm without panic. And I think that's the organization, I think, is at the end of game is really big. And I think that's what cost Duquesne at VCU, because those two big plays where Tibiasu rose and fired from 3-point range, it was the same spot and it was set plays and she was in rhythm, and it just they made the better play on that end of the ball than Duquesne made on the defensive end. So really, they're very, very talented teams. And I mean, I don't see a Cinderella. It's going to be one of those 5 teams. I mean, could Rhode Island pull a surprise? Sure, but I don't think they're going to. I just don't feel that they can do more than that because, again, it's been such a top heavy league this year, which is just so bizarre to say. Normally, you know who your 1 and who your 2 are going to be, and everybody else is kind of jockeying for position. There was a Saturday where we're still ripping our proverbial hair because we don't even know what one of the scenarios necessarily is. That's just how close this has been, and just that speaks to the parity of just how talented the league is. But when you have such a talented top of the league, the bottom of the league sometimes can bring it down a little bit too. And St. Bonaventure had some growing pains this year. UMass had some growing pains this year. LaSalle losing those three Jacob sisters really, really hurt them. So, I mean, just not throwing any of them under the bus, GW underachieved this year, and I know they would admit that too. I think there was just some general tiredness from some of those upperclassmen that just really reared its head. But I mean, it's going to be a fun tournament. I think there's always going to be some good games, but there's something to be said about the quality of game. And I think anything in the quarterfinals on is going to be very, very high quality. It's going to be different from what you see, but that's not to say that there could still be some surprises in store, because there's some very talented kids, and when it comes to intangibles, there's no measurement for desperation, and there's going to be a lot of desperation. So it'll be interesting to see. And of course, I'll be covering it for the Atlantic 10 conference. So it'll be interesting to see how everything plays out.
Yeah, one thing that you mentioned earlier was that you wanted to see, you think that there should be a lot of positivity on the women's side of things for Duquesne. And I agree with that. I don't think they would get overly optimistic to the point of arrogant. I am worried about that from the men's side of things this year, but I don't think I really have much to fear about, because regardless of how well they close out this season, they're still gonna look back at their record and say, not what would the top be, 9-7, 10-7? That's not good enough for what their preseason expectations were.
Well, sure. The men's preseason expectation was extremely high, and that College of Charleston win was so huge in so many ways. But to go 0-5, I don't care who it's against. I think it's a shock to the system. And I mean, Day Day Grant's injury was a backbreaker, but without Day Day Grant's injury, I don't know if Jake DeMichael fully develops either. And so, I mean, I think there was something good that came out of that stretch. And I think the biggest problem was that Keith kind of had his hand in the cookie jar, and there were too many toys, and it was tough to figure out what the shiny toy was at the right time. And I mean, when you play a game of Operation and you don't have the right piece to put on the board, you're going to get buzzed. And when you have so many players that have very similar strengths and weaknesses, that really creates a lot of challenge. And there's questions. How much do you let a guy go? How much do you let a guy develop? Why does this guy develop over the other guy? And when do you just learn to live with your decisions for your successes and for your failures? And I think all of that was really a learning process, not just for Keith Dambrot, but for this team as a whole. And I think that's why you see the conference record at 8-8 right now. Is I think there was some disappointment. And I think that when you have such a strong early start to your conference where it's time to impose your will, and you're coming off somewhat of a high and you just aren't able to do it. I mean, the UMass loss kind of set the tone. That's always a tough trip to get up for. And then you lose at Loyola in a game you probably should have won. And then the Richmond game was such a heartbreaker, and you have such a heartbreaker there, and then you lose in the closing seconds to a St. Joe's team that you really should have beaten there. So I think that made the Bonaventure game their Super Bowl. And if they had lost that Bonaventure game, Lord only knows what would have happened to that team. So credit to them for grinding out a result that was probably a tougher win at the end than it should have been. But I mean, that's just what happens. But for this team to be 8-8 after they go 0-5 to start is a credit to Keith Dambrot and the staff, and for the team in general for just rolling with the punches, understanding that it's not going to be perfect, but making it perfect for them.
Yeah, we mentioned Keith kind of needing to figure out that rotation and sticking with it, and he had for a lot of the second half of conference play. And then the latest game against Mason, he kind of changed things up again. Put Kareem into the starting rotation, taking Jake out, and then moving. he had started Dixon a game or two and then decided to go back on that plan as well. Obviously there wasn't an opportunity for you to ask him any questions after the game, but what were your thoughts about him again kind of fiddling with the rotation at this point?
I think at this point, Keith just wants to do whatever it takes to win. I think it goes back to matchups. It depends on the intangibles from George Mason. It seemed like if George Mason wanted to impose their will, then you put a Duchamp in there. And you also, I think in his mind, he also wanted to reward Duchamp just again continuing to start him because of that last game, the chemistry that him and Jimmy really, really had, combining for 5. And if there had been a dunk, and if Duchamp had finished that dunk, should have been 6 assists together. For Kareem, I think Jake really the last couple of games has gotten in some foul trouble. He hasn't been making the shots that he's been making before, and the defense is just a touch off. He still gives you a good rebounding edge and he can give you plays, but I think some of the opponents are starting to figure out what he can do. But Keith is giving him the opportunity to grow. But with Kareem, you have a natural leader on the floor. You don't have to worry about the communication. Will he make shots? Not all of the time, but you know that he's going to be steady and he's not going to make the worst mistake that's going to completely kill you and take you out of the game. So, as far as Dixon's concerned, I think it again goes back to the fouling situation. I mean, he picked up 4 yesterday against George Mason. So, I mean, I think the fouls are still a genuine concern, but you have to balance it. He's still keeping Trey Williams in the game because he values that defense. But of the starters, time and time again, Trey is getting the hook, and then you don't even see him until maybe the middle of the second half. So it seems like Keith is kind of going to the beat of his own drum, for better or for worse. And if they're winning, then I think they understand at this point it's nothing personal. It's just getting the result at the end of the day. And for them right now, they're a projected 7 seed in the tournament right now. And if you had told 0-5 Duquesne that you're going to be a 7 seed right now with a couple of games left, now there are a couple of challenging games in different respects. VCU's a very tough place to play. We talked about it on the women's side. And VCU's the only team of the top 4 right now that's not projected for the double bye. So if you don't think that they're going to be up for Tuesday's game, then you're going to be fooling yourself. But Duquesne has a lot to fight for as well. I mean, that at this point, having a bye doesn't necessarily matter as long as you get the bye and stay out of the first day of games. It's about what form are you in and how are you doing that? And there's a good opportunity to do that against a George Washington team that in terms of schematics just hasn't found the answers necessarily. And even St. Louis, with for all their warts, has passed them now in the conference. So I think there's a lot to be said about the opportunity that Senior Day Saturday could present itself. But VCU, if you win that game against VCU, I mean, immediately this team is back on the map. It doesn't matter if it's a 37-36 game or if it's an 87-86 game. It really doesn't. At this point, you're going to sell out. And frankly, the men did not make the trip back to Pittsburgh after Mason. There's no reason to. It's spring break. They're going to lock in, they're going to focus, and they want to end this season the right way. And if that means that they have to play another game of tag and smile and laugh together, play a game of pickleball to make it right for themselves, that's exactly what they're going to do. They're going to go to the beat of their own drum, just like they're going to take every team is a reflection of their head coach. And that feistiness that Keith has and that willingness to embrace the uncomfortable and make it into a comfortable is something that he's really been tested on this year. And for the most part, it seems like, especially down this stretch here, it seems like he's been able to find that.
Yeah. What would you think the ideal I guess closing lineup be for the men's team? At this point I would think it's similar to what we've had before with Jimmy at playing kind of like the pseudo point guard position, depending on how well he's played. That's one area where I do understand Keith having that pull, where if he's being turnover prone and he's not doing the true Point Clark moves where he's driving to the lane and finding the bigs for easy buckets and he's just taking shots to try and force things, then I could see him not getting that closing point guard position. I know Kareem does a lot of things right, but at the end of games, Jimmy has just seemed to show the knack to be the closer, whether it's that ridiculous 3-point shots or being the one guy that is consistently finding a way to drive to the basket to initiate things.
Are we swearing or no?
Yeah, we can.
So you're asking me for a starting lineup?
Closing lineup, because starting lineup doesn't matter in Dan Brown's world.
Because honestly, the fuck if I know. I mean, we're at the point where it's just who's the hot hand that day. I mean, who got you to this opportunity to get to the promised land? That's really what it boils down to. You know Day Day's going to be there because he's going to make shots. You know that if Jimmy's head is on right, that Jimmy will be out there. And more often than not, it is. But it seems when Day Day's not out there, he pushes way too much and he takes on way too much for himself. And it's affected both ends of the ball. I personally would have Fusini out there. Just if I want somebody to get a rebound, Fusini's that guy that's going to get me that rebound, and I feel really comfortable in saying that. So you have three spots that I would say are almost guaranteed. So at that point, I would say Dixon too. So you have four, assuming he's not in foul trouble. So at this point, the fifth, it feels like you're almost at spring training in March here. It's by committee. What do you need in that moment? Do you need a steady head? Do you need a defensive stop? Do you need the intangible? Do you need the uncomfortable? I mean, it depends on what you need. I mean, if you need a stop, then Trey Williams is in there. If you need a steady head, then Kareem's in there. If you want the right play at the right time, you probably put a Jakob or you probably put a Jake out there. It just depends on what the game calls for and even what the opponent is. For all the criticism that Keith gets for not having a combination, there are some wrinkles to some of these players' games where based on the opponent and based on who's feeling themselves in that moment is the direction that he can go on. I mean, let's not forget that Matouche made that big shot at St. Joe's that put them in position to almost steal that game and probably should have stolen that game. So it's not like he's afraid to push a button that maybe others wouldn't expect him to push. Matouche had a really good couple of weeks there where he really had started to figure things out, but Keith played, the matchups and Matouche's opportunities for the most part eroded. But that's not to say that he's not shot ready. I mean, he did take one shot and he made his shot in his 4 minutes against George Mason. And again, that was a game where points were a little bit harder to come by. It was back to that win ugly on the road. And that's a very important win because now you have that game up over them with 2 games to play. As long as you don't go 0-2 or as long as George Mason doesn't get a result, then you're past George Mason. And that's huge because that's one less team you have to worry about to try to avoid a 10 seed. Because at this point, whether you're seed 5 or whether you're seed 9, it really doesn't matter. You just don't want to be 10. And it's pretty much what Keith conveyed earlier in the week after the game. Just at this point, we just want the bye. It just doesn't matter. And them playing a first round game, I would say would be a disastrous result. I mean, for all they've climbed back, which makes VCU's game on Tuesday, which I will be covering in person, is going to be possibly the most competitive game of the season mentally because both teams have so much to fight for because VCU does not want to avoid that double bye and they want to have that secured. And Duquesne is trying like hell to just hang on and continue to claw and again take after their coach and claw and work for absolutely everything that they can. I mean, they if they can tie St. Bonaventure, then that's a leapfrog on St. Bonaventure as well. But St. Bonaventure has at G Dub and against St. Louis. So you almost have to have a broken serve of somehow. And if you do that, I mean, you could get as high as as high as 6. And then what happens? Then it just depends. I mean, no one thought Dayton would be number 3 in the A10 right now. I mean, Loyola's really turned things around, and Drew Valentine should be the coach of the year in the Atlantic 10, in my opinion. So there's a lot of challenge, but I mean, Duquesne feels really good about being matched up against Richmond. They would feel good about Loyola Chicago, and we'll see how well they match up with VCU on Tuesday. They felt like they can hang with every team, although the first game against Dayton was kind of fool's gold because they just started off so terribly. and the game at Dayton, they just died on the vine in the second half. So they've shown they can compete, but they've also shown that whenever De'Ron Holmes wants to take over the game, that they just don't have an answer either. So if they can avoid Dayton, that would be their best road. But at this point, you want the bye more than anything. So that bye is just so huge. They can't afford to play a first round game. So it'll be interesting to see how it all unravels. And of course, I mean, it'll be interesting to see how everything unfolds for Keith too. I mean, there's been chatter, there's been murmurs around everything with, is this it for Keith or not? And he has not said anything on record, so there's nothing to confirm whether he is or isn't going to be a part of things. But what is known is that he's had Drew kind of take the lead on defense, and Drew's been at press conferences, he's done all the radio interviews. So whenever that time comes, it's clear that he wants Drew to be the voice of this team moving forward. So whether that's next season, whether that's 2 seasons, or any time beyond, it's very clear that he's indirectly or directly campaigning for Drew Joyce to be the man for the job for the next time around, whenever that next time around is. So I think that if this is it for Keith, then I think that alone is very motivating for this team to put together a really, really good end of the season. And even if it isn't, Keith has unfortunately been through so much this year, with his wife having to go through so many battles off of the court. And that's been very, very challenging for him as well. And he has been very open about sharing that. And power on him for sharing a very private and very personal story and circumstance. And obviously, prayers continue to go to Donna. She continues to pull through, into the entire Dambrot family. It's very easy to focus on the results and get so wrapped up on the results. I mean, we have now for over 40 minutes, almost 50 minutes, but at the end of the day, we're discussing a game that's decided by a circular ball and a rim. And the game of life sometimes reminds you that there is more to it, and that basketball is a vehicle to success in so many different ways. And the Dambrot family's really exemplified that. So obviously, I mean, there's been a lot for Keith to fight for, and there's been a lot for these players to fight for. And these players have had circumstances as well that they've had to overcome. So just all the credit in the world to this team for bouncing back from such a sputtery start in the A10. I know this is not the season they were expecting. They were expecting a double bye, and they were expecting to have some real momentum. But I mean, it's not too late. It really, really isn't. They're peaking at the right time. They've put a lot of things together. They've figured a lot of things out, and they have a really good opportunity against VCU on Tuesday, and I'm really interested to see how they take it.
Yeah, and I mean, very convenient timing for you to be able to go down there and then cover the women's basketball tournament all in the same period of time.
Thank you, A10.
Yeah, they finally gave you one. Look at them.
No, the A10's given me some good opportunities. I can't complain. And a shout out to Bernadette McGlade, Drew Dickerson, and Ben Kessler, among several others in that office, for doing so.
Yeah, I mean, to sum all of this up, from both the women's and the men's side,
if we
it
can.
is, yeah, it is. It's do or die, and it seems like this year is kind of the year to focus on, because next year there's so many players that are leaving, potential coaching changes. It's so important for these teams to try their best to capture these moments and execute to the best of their abilities, because this could be a special year for both teams, or it could be a heartbreaking year for both teams.
Well, I mean, define heartbreak, because in reality, 14 teams are going to feel heartbreak. I mean, the odds of, not to sound pessimistic, but in general, 14 teams are going to be pissed off at the end of this. Well, not necessarily 14, because there's always postseason play, but you dream of an Atlantic 10 championship and an automatic berth in the NCAA tournament, and you dream not having to sweat on selection Sunday or selection Monday, whatever the case circumstances for women's basketball now. But that's the dream, and the reality is we're probably right. There's probably only going to be one A10 women's team, and then the men's have been teetering around one or two. I mean, Loyola beating Dayton has to help their potential case of an at-large, but how much is that going to be? The non-conference kind of was what it was. And Richmond, I don't think necessarily had the profile going in. So really, could it just be Dayton or bust? Or is the Atlantic 10's only chance if for multiple bids in men's if Dayton doesn't win? And then hoping that because Dayton's been ranked that they've done enough to get an at-large bid. So it'll be interesting to see. So when the chips fall down, it'll be interesting to see what happens, and it'll be interesting to see what the sidelines are going to look like next year. But it's a little bit too early to look into that, really. I mean, there's still a lot of season left for both teams, and again, the women could have as few as one game left. They could have as many as a half dozen or more games left, and the men are guaranteed at least 3 more games, if not more. So it just depends on what their response is, knowing the sense of urgency and not getting too wrapped up in the moment to find your peace and find your success. Or as men's basketball assistant Ari Stern loves to post on social media, if you can find your court. So it'll really be determinant on how that goes. And I'm sure Ari's going to laugh if he sees that sound clip. But regardless of that, it's going to be very, very interesting. Both teams have had very, very low points, but have chosen the high road and have turned their season around. So how that ends up is going to be very interesting to see. The women have a very legitimate chance of winning the whole A10 tournament. The men have a chance of making some noise and extending their season in postseason play. And it'll be interesting to see how it all shakes out. So it's going to be an interesting ride. It might not be a fun ride, but it'll be a very, very interesting ride.
Oh, we've got to get at least one NIT out of these two teams. That's all I'm saying. That would be the heartbreak for me if both of their seasons end at the A10 conference tournament level, and we don't even get an NIT bid from one of these two. Just knowing the talent that both of these teams have, that's where that's where the worry is. And then on the optimistic standpoint, they have enough talent where they could win the whole thing. So that's the roller coaster that's going inside of my brain as a fan, and I'm sure so many others. But like you said, just gotta enjoy the moment, gotta watch the games happen and see what happens.
It's enjoyable torture.
Yes. The summary of an A10 basketball fan in one sentence. It's enjoyable.
What you mean? It wasn't inadvertent whistle? Too soon?
Yeah, no, the George Mason game left a lot of people upset with refereeing.
The
Understandably.
the 1-and-1 miss was so.
That
I
is,
mean, come on, how does the book miss that? And how do they not look at the board, which has it?
I don't know.
That's the other thing too, and it's what people don't realize. It's the little things and not to single the George Mason scorekeeper out, but when whoever does the book, you have to be on your P's and Q's with the book. If there's 2 shots, you stick up 2 fingers. If it's a 1-and-1, you do the 1-and-1. I mean, if you have the error, you're immediately definitive. You immediately let your PA know. I mean, credit to Doug on the Duquesne end. He does a great job of it, but the Mason scorekeeper just left so much confusion, and Mason had every right to be upset by that because they were off to the races. Duquesne had literally frozen. That was an easy 2 points. But hey, I mean, it all worked out for Duquesne in the end. And hat tip to Amari Kelly from George Mason, by the way. Obviously did not have the game he desired against his former team, but it's good to see him back in the A10 doing his thing. Very, very good kid.
Yeah, and has had a solid season to this point. I really
Yesterday was standing, yeah.
Yeah. So great for him. Was did see some really great things from him his freshman year with us and thought he had a chance to shine. And then I think he had the ACL injury, right? To have to recover from, and then that was part of the transfer out as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, that's his thing. I mean, remember, Jimmy transferred out of VCU and he went out of D1 and then he came back with a vengeance. And I think that chip off his shoulder is why he's such a good fit for Duquesne. He constantly plays like he has something to prove. And if you don't think that Jimmy Clark is going to be ready for Tuesday, then if last year, obviously Mike Rhodes was still on the sideline last year, but I mean, there's still a lot to be said. I think that Jimmy's going to be ready. There's no doubt about that. I hope he's not too ready, but I hope that I would think that Jimmy's going to be ready for Tuesday's game against VCU. And again, that'll be so fun because I think it's going to come down to the very, very last couple of possessions, just because there's just too much on the line for both teams. And it's going to come down to who wants it more, and that's always such a raucous environment. And also, selfishly, I hope the Peppers stop playing after the game ends and not going 30 minutes after the game ends. That would be very, very helpful.
Yeah. All right, folks. I don't know. I know we didn't cover games in much detail. This happens every few episodes now where we end up having to take like multiple weeks break in between games because of schedules between Alec and I. And I explained that to Zach, and he was like, "Well, let's just do a pod." I said, "All right." So, we've got a few more games in the regular season, and then uh we'll see how much more Duquesne basketball we'll have to enjoy.
Either way, it's been a privilege to be on the ride and tell some of these stories, to be able to tell specifically the stories of Chabi and Lauren this season has been an absolute pleasure, and I don't lose sight of how thankful I am to both of them for trusting me when maybe the coaching staffs weren't the most excited about me doing what I was doing, but they were sure in their convictions. And of course, I followed HIPAA and everything too. So shout out to HIPAA. But just in general, I mean, thankful for the relationships that I've had with the players, and hopeful that I don't make any more fashion choices that don't piss Keith Dambrot off too much as the season continues.
Oh, but the post game presser where he had to admit that he does like you. He,
I mean, it had to be said. It's so funny because it almost feels like a comedy routine, but it's just not. It's instinctual, and and I guess I'll go long-winded on this too. Regardless of whether this is or isn't it for Keith, and I know there's been a lot of commotion both ways about it, I'm very, very thankful for what Keith has brought out in me as a reporter and what Keith has brought out for me as a person. And from the first press conference where he took me seriously because I gave him the respect, and to the first text conversation where he wanted to read an article and he read the article and he was happy, to he was one of the first people that texted me to see if I was okay after the synagogue shooting happened in a few years ago. So just Keith consistently has always been there for me, but has, he understands that it's a job, and Keith has really let me do my job. He's trusted me. He's told me stuff to help my coverage, and just Keith has been consistent. And it's a shame that some people on the board like to disparage a coach that really has brought a lot of winning back to Duquesne. There wasn't a 10-year plan where people were so consumed. And I get that the expectation was high, but you also have to understand that he was bringing winning out, and he was doing it by taking players that nobody necessarily wanted and leading them to new heights and challenging them. And the players who left. Some of it was talent related, some of it could have been, not the right fit. Some of it, in the one big case, it was just him wanting to have control back of the program and do things his way because he could see where the pendulum was going. And you know what? Not a lot of coaches would be willing to take that chance and understand that there's a down year and that people are going to write you off and leave you for dead. But not everybody's Keith Dambrot either. And for him to overcome that and really to face a little bit of a mini crisis of sorts with 0-5 in conference play this year, and for the team to respond so well says a lot about who he is as a coach, but a lot about who he is as a person. Has it been perfect? Has he been perfect? Far from it. But I mean, you have to respect what he's done. And I know that I'm going to get canceled on the Duquesne board right now, but I could not give less of a fuck. But really, just the respect that I have for Keith is immense. And whether it's Keith Dambrot, whether it's Drew Joyce, or whether it's something in between next year, it will be very, very interesting to see how it unfolds. And I'm thankful.
Yeah, I mean, I get that that board is there for people to post their thoughts as fans, but I at the same time, I mean, I got into a fight with them last year about just clearly showing that Dan Broad is the best coach that we've had since the glory years. That's been 50 years, and they're disparaging the guy who has brought us back. It's unquestionably in a much better place now than it was when he came here.
No doubt.
There's a reason why he had to bring in all these transfers from a lower conference to try and build a team up, and it's because there wasn't any big names that were going to choose Duquesne basketball. And now
Well, sure.
I think there are players that are legitimately talented freshmen that are choosing Duquesne basketball.
Well, sure. And I think it's also a lot of those fans are also older fans that have been through these doldrums and have seen the same old Duquesne and seen that so many of these teams have written Duquesne off as an easy win. And Keith Danbrot changed that. And now sometimes when you have those expectations and you have those results, this is what happens. It's part of the nature of the beast, but it's also just enjoy what you have. I mean, Pitt did not enjoy what they have when they lost Jamie Dixon, and look how long it took for them to come back, and they're still not all the way back. So, I mean, a credit to what Keith has done. I know it's not the most popular thing to say, but hopefully it's not revisionist history if you're a Duquesne fan if it goes the other direction, which obviously you hope it doesn't. But by all accounts, I mean, Keith has had some down years. Keith has made several wrong decisions, but I think this team wouldn't be nearly what it is without Keith and without what Keith was able to do. So just, I am going to give Keith the credit for that.
And similar kudos to Coach Burt. Another, not much criticism going his way on those fan boards, but just a lot of kudos need to be given to a guy who has consistently held Duquesne in a pretty great place in terms of basketball, especially when the city across town has struggled to find a coach during his entire tenure at Duquesne. They found a possible good one now from UMass, but again, it's another year where the results don't necessarily show much of a difference. I understand it's year one, but continuity means a lot, especially when it comes to a program that has been successful. And I definitely want to see Coach Burt continue here as long as I can. Just enjoying them every moment.
As long as he can, really. I mean, this year he's earned that right with the decisions that were made to kind of strip a lot of stuff down and just slow things down physically, mentally, and everything in between. And this is the time of year that that's paid dividends. Are they necessarily playing their best basketball right now? No, but I don't think they're that far off. I really, really don't. And a lot of it's kind of hard to tell just because they've played a lot of better teams at this end of the year. I mean, as a conference, having matchups against 1 and 2 with your double bye on the line is exactly what you want to see. And the 2 games that Duquesne had were not bad games. They just had 2 really bad lulls at really inopportune times when shots just started to fall. And sometimes you just throw your hands up and there's just nothing you can do. But I think that, that fits Duquesne's narrative of being the underdogs as being the overlooked. And nobody's embraced that and used that to piss their team off more than Dan Burr. And he knows the buttons to push this time of year. Heck, he's taken a fine from the Atlantic 10 office for it when he complained about foul disparity against St. Louis several years back. So, I mean, I think that they'll be ready. I think they'll be pissed off with a lot of fire in the belly, and it'll be interesting to see what happens. But, I mean, there's so many good coaches for Coach of the Year on the women's side. Dan has certainly made a case. It'll be interesting to see what happens. I don't think ultimately it will be Dan. I think what Vanessa Blair Lewis has done with George Mason has been nothing short of incredible. Of course, everybody loves picking the top coach, but Aaron Roussel with Richmond, very great person, a friend, and somebody that has brought a lot out of the team and done some unexpected things. I mean, even Allison Guth at Loyola Chicago, I mean, that program last year just could not catch a break and just couldn't get on their feet. And just this year has really put some good, inspiring basketball together. I mean, but what Beth O'Boyle did, I mean, she did it several years ago. It was like a 7-8 win team last year, and she did what she did. Cindy Griffin, always great with Joe's. Even Gail Folks at Davidson, what they were able to do non-conference. It's a very talented league of coaches. And I mean, for Dan to be the most second most tenured one in the Atlantic 10, says a lot. He just this year achieved milestone wins and A10 wins within the program. So really, he continues to grow as his team does. And the longer you coach, the harder it can be to stay relevant and stay relatable to your players. But Dan has not wavered, and Dan has been able to stick with the times and get the most out of his players too, time in and time again. And I think that's very special and unique. And had the setting been correct, which yesterday was definitely not the right setting, it would have been nice to ask him a question about having to be able to celebrate an actual senior day in a day and age when so many of these seniors transfer out, men's and women's, and for him to have seniors that were with the program for at least multiple years, if not longer, and able to celebrate. And it speaks to what Dan built, how he built it, and that they believe in what he has built and maintained. And I know the last few years have not been up to standard. Last year was kind of a return towards that standard. This year, at least from conference play, they're back on that standard and they can feel it. And it's exciting again. I can say that.
Yeah. All right. So we've got the coaches, we've got the inspiration we need, we've got the talent. Let's get it done. I
And Zach
understand
Cust and Zach Cust.
and Zach Cust. So that tells you everything. And I understand you're not going to say it, so I'll say it for everybody. Let's go Dukes.
The Dukes are back and now it's time to